Out of the hundreds of attacks that have ended lives at schools in modern history, almost everyone was carried out by a boy or a man. The girls who ever did the same can nearly be counted on two hands. That makes them some of the rarest figures in criminal history, and it raises a question few people ask. When a teenage girl is the one who walks in and takes a life, what is actually driving her? The answer, across every case here, is rarely what you would expect. These girls almost never set out to harm the world. They set out to harm one person, a former best friend, a girlfriend, a rival over a boy, a classmate they could not stop thinking about. Their actions were personal, almost always rooted in love, jealousy, or pain that everyone missed until far too late. 10 girls, 5 decades, 4 countries, from a girl at a window across the street to a blade in a classroom. Let us begin. Section 1. The Girl Across the Street. On the morning of January 29, 1979, a small crowd of children gathered outside Grover Cleveland Elementary School in the quiet San Carlos neighborhood of San Diego, California. It was a Monday. The kids were waiting by the front gate for the principal to unlock it so the school day could start. Most of them were little, somewhere between 5 and 11 years old. They had backpacks and lunch bags, and some were still rubbing the sleep out of their eyes. Not one of them knew that someone was watching them from a window across the street, holding a rifle. Someone was a 16-year-old girl named Brenda Ann Spencer. She lived in a small house that faced the school directly, close enough that she could see the children clearly without ever stepping outside. A few weeks earlier, for Christmas, father had given her a gift that almost no parent would think to give a struggling teenager. It was a semi-automatic .22 caliber rifle, along with a box of ammunition. On that Monday morning, Brenda pointed it out of her window and began to fire on the children across the street. The first child she hit was 9-year-old Cam Miller. Years later, investigators and Cam himself would say he believed he was chosen first for a reason that makes the whole thing feel even colder. He was wearing blue that day, and blue was Brenda's favourite colour. After that first shot, calm morning broke apart. Children started running and screaming. Some dropped to the ground, others froze, unsure what was even happening, because gunfire outside an elementary school was almost unheard of back then. What happened next is the part of the story that often gets forgotten, and it deserves to be remembered most of all. The adults at the school did not run away. They ran toward the danger. The principal, 53-year-old Burton Ragg, rushed out to pull children to safety. As he tried to shield them, Brenda fired at him, and he did not survive. A teacher named Darryl Barnes was also out there trying to help, and he was lucky to live through it. Then the school custodian, 56-year-old Mike Suchar, a man the kids simply knew as a friendly face around the building, ran out to drag a student out of harm's way. Brenda fired on him too. He passed away at the scene. The 2 grown men who lost their lives that day were not soldiers or guards. They were ordinary school staff who chose, in a few terrifying seconds, to put their bodies between a teenager with a rifle and a group of frightened kids. That choice is the reason a lot of those children went home that day. Help came quickly, but it came into the line of fire. A 28-year-old San Diego police officer named Robert Robb was one of the first to arrive. As he reached the scene, Brenda hit him in the neck. He survived his injury, but the wound showed just how exposed everyone was. The front of the school sat in open view of Brenda's window, with almost nothing to hide behind. To fix that, officers did something clever and brave, brought a garbage truck and parked it in front of the school as a giant moving shield, blocking her view and giving people a wall to stand behind. That truck quietly saved lives. By the time it was over, 2 people had lost their lives and 9 others were injured, 8 of them children. and one of them, the officer, Brenda, fired around 36 rounds in total. Then she stopped, pulled back inside her house, and locked herself in. Followed was a standoff that stretched on for hours. Police surrounded the home while a 16-year-old sat inside with a rifle, refusing to come out. During that standoff, something strange happened that turned a local tragedy into a story the whole world would talk about. Porter managed to reach Brenda by telephone inside the house. He asked her why she had done it. Her answer was so flat, so empty of any feeling, people still repeat it more than 40 years later. She told him she did not like Mondays, and that doing this livened up the day. There was no anger in it, and no real explanation. Just a bored, careless reason for an act that had ended 2 lives and shattered dozens more. After several hours, Brenda finally gave herself up and walked out of the house. She was taken into custody without further harm to anyone. The standoff was finished, but the questions were only beginning. To understand how a teenage girl ended up in that window, you have to look at the years before that morning, and the picture is a troubled one. Brenda was known around her neighborhood and school as a girl in trouble. She skipped school often. She had a history of petty theft and drug use. People who knew her described someone who seemed angry and disconnected. She had even fired a BB gun at the windows of that same elementary school before, almost like a warning that no one took seriously. Prowls. In the days leading up to the attack, she reportedly told classmates that she was going to do something big, something that would get her on television. Most people who heard her brushed it off. Teenagers say dramatic things. Nobody imagined she meant it. The rifle itself became one of the most disturbing details of the whole case. It had not been bought in secret or stolen. It was handed to her by her own father as a holiday present. Over the years that followed, Brenda gave shifting accounts of that gift and of her state of mind that morning. At times, she said she had been under the influence of alcohol and drugs and was not fully aware of what she was doing. At other times, she claimed she had hoped officers would arrive and end her life for her, even suggested her father had given her the firearm, hoping she would harm herself. These were her own later explanations, and some of them were disputed, with different reports describing different findings. What stayed constant was the basic, awful fact at the centre of it. A teenager had a rifle, a clear view of small children, and she used it. Because of how serious the crime was, prosecutors made a decision that was rare for someone so young. They charged Brenda as an adult rather than as a juvenile. In 1980, she pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder and to assault with a deadly weapon. The judge sentenced her to 25 years to life behind bars. She was sent to the California Institution for Women in Chino, where she has remained ever since. What makes her case unusual is not only what she did, but how long the story has lasted. Brenda Spencer has come up for parole many times across the decades. Again and again, she has been denied. Survivors of that morning and the families of the people who passed away have shown up to those hearings, year after year, asking the board to keep her where she is. Cam Miller, the 9-year-old boy in blue who was hit first, grew up and spoke at hearings as an adult, describing how that day took away his sense of safety, in a way that never fully came back. Granddaughter of the principal has spoken about how the family has to relive the pain every single time a hearing comes around. As of 2026, after more than 4 decades and her most recent denial in early 2025, Brenda Spencer is still in prison. There's one more piece of this story that pushed it far beyond San Diego, and it shows how a single careless sentence can echo around the planet. On the day of the attack, an Irish musician named Bob Geldof was at a college radio station in Atlanta, doing an interview with his bandmate. telex machine beside him, printed out the news as it came in, including Brenda's flat little reason about not liking Mondays. Geldof was so struck by how empty that explanation was that he wrote a song about it on the spot with his bandmate Johnny Fingers. His group, Boomtown Rats, released it later that year. The song was called I Don't Like Mondays. It became a massive hit. It reached #1 in the United Kingdom and in several other countries. And it is still one of the most recognisable songs of its era in the United States, though it never caught on the same way. Radio stations in San Diego refused to play it out of respect for the families. Brenda's own family tried, without success, to stop it from coming out as a single in America. In later years, Geldof said he actually regretted the song because he felt it had done something he never intended. It had made Brenda Spencer famous. A teenage girl who hurt children had been turned, in a way, into a piece of pop culture. And the man who wrote the song was not comfortable with that. That discomfort points to the reason this case still matters and still opens a story like this one. Brenda Spencer is widely described as the first person to carry out a mass attack at an elementary school in the United States, and as one of the first modern school attackers of any kind. The grim truth is that the kind of violence she committed, which felt almost impossible to imagine in 1979, would slowly become something the world learned to fear. Her name now sits at the very front of a long and painful history. People who study these events sometimes point to her as a starting point, a teenager whose actions came before the larger tragedies that the public would later come to know all too well. And yet, even within that dark history, Brenda stands apart for a reason that runs through this entire story. Almost everyone who has carried out this kind of attack has been male. A teenage girl doing what Brenda did was, and still is, extraordinarily rare. For decades, researchers who track these events could count the girls involved on their fingers. That rarity is exactly why her case became so famous. And it is exactly why the cases in this video are so unsettling. We are not looking at a common pattern. We are looking at the small handful of times it broke the other way. So this is where the story begins. A 16-year-old at a window, rifle that came wrapped as a gift. 2 adults who passed away trying to protect children. And a bored answer that turned into a worldwide song. It is the oldest case in this video, and in many ways it is the blueprint that everything after it would be measured against. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, but there is something important to notice about what Brenda did. She fired from a distance at strangers, small children she did not personally know, through a window and across a street. The next girl in this story did something that, in its own way, is even harder to understand. She did not aim at a crowd from far away. She walked up close, looked straight at the person in front of her, and that person was not a stranger at all. She was someone the girl had once called a friend. Section 2. Friend. She couldn't lose. On the morning of November 12, 2008, a 15-year-old girl named Amanda Collette walked the hallways of Dillard High School in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, the way she did every school day. Amanda was a sophomore. She was known for being kind and quiet, and she was a standout on the school's hip-hop dance squad, the kind of student other kids smiled at in the hall. It was a normal Wednesday. Classes were changing around. 11 in the morning, the hallways packed with teenagers moving between rooms, talking, laughing, carrying their books. Amanda had no idea that a girl she had once been close to was walking through that same crowd with a firearm hidden in her backpack. That girl was T. Wimberly, also 15, also a sophomore at Dillard. The two of them were not strangers. They had been friends since they were little kids in elementary school. For years, they had been part of each other's lives. In the weeks before that morning, something had changed between them. They had stopped talking. The closeness they once had was gone, for Tia. That loss seemed to grow into something much darker than ordinary teenage drama. Near the school's computer lab, in a busy corridor full of students, T pulled out a small chrome pistol. She fired one shot at Amanda, striking her in the torso. Then she turned and walked away. What happened next was strange and confusing, and it tells you a lot about how unexpected this was. Firearm was a small caliber, and the single shot was quiet enough that many students nearby were not even sure a shot had been fired. Amanda fell to the hallway floor. Kids screamed and scattered, but at first nobody could confirm what had actually happened. There was no obvious sign at a glance. Some people thought she had fainted. It took time for the adults to understand that a student had been seriously hurt by a firearm inside their school. By then, it was already too late to save her. Amanda Collette lost her life that day, 15-year-old, who had simply come to school to learn and dance with her friends. While the school was still trying to make sense of the chaos, Tia did something that set her case apart from many others. She did not hide, and she did not run far. She walked off campus, crossed the street, to a small seafood takeout restaurant called Captain Crab's, and called the authorities herself. She told them she had hurt her friend. When officers arrived, she was there waiting, and they took her into custody and recovered the firearm. No standoff and no chase. The girl who had just taken a life turned herself in within minutes, almost as if she could not believe what she had done either. In the days that followed, investigators pieced together a picture that was heartbreaking from almost every angle. The reason behind the attack was not money, not a fight over something stolen, not gang trouble. It was, at its core, about a broken friendship and a teenager who was in enormous pain, according to what later came out in court. Tia had developed deep feelings for Amanda. Defense team would argue that she had convinced herself the two of them were more than friends, even though that was not how Amanda saw it. When the friendship fell apart and Amanda stopped speaking to her, Tia was unable to handle the loss. She reportedly told investigators that she wanted Amanda to feel the same pain she was feeling inside. That sentence is the saddest key to the whole case. This was not a girl who hated her victim. In a twisted, broken way, it was the opposite. Tia hurt Amanda because she could not stand losing her, and because she was drowning in feelings she had no healthy way to manage. Closeness that had once made them friends was the very thing that turned into something deadly. When you look at who Tia was before that morning, the picture gets more complicated, and it is important to understand it without using it as an excuse. Her childhood had been deeply troubled. Parents had split before she was even born, and she was raised by her grandparents. During the trial, her lawyers described a young person who had suffered serious abuse and trauma growing up, and who struggled badly with depression and dark thoughts about herself. Court filings from her defense said she had been mistreated within her own family. Whether or not every detail was proven, what was clear was that this was a teenager who had been carrying heavy wounds for a long time, with very little real help. There were also warning signs in the hours right before the attack, and they are painful to think about, because they suggest this might have been stopped. The night before, Tia had hurt herself badly and had been in serious emotional crisis. And on the day itself, before the attack, a classmate later said that Tia had spoken about wanting to harm Amanda, and even showed signs that she had brought something dangerous to school. Classmate tried to alert a teacher. What exactly was said, and what the teacher understood, became a matter of dispute. Teacher involved stated that he was never told there was a firearm. But the warning, in some form, existed. Young person in crisis had signalled that something terrible was coming, and the message did not turn into action in time to save Amanda. That failure became the centre of a lawsuit later on. Amanda's family sued the Broward County School Board, arguing that the school had been warned that a student had a firearm and intended to use it. The school had handheld metal detector wands available that were not being used that day. The school board did not admit wrongdoing, but it agreed to settle the case, paying Amanda's family a sum reported at $525,000. No amount of money could bring their daughter back, but the settlement stood as an acknowledgement that a school is supposed to keep its students safe, and that on that day, the system meant to protect Amanda had not worked. The legal road for Tia herself was long and emotional, first charged with first-degree murder and with bringing a firearm onto school grounds. Because of the seriousness of what she had done, prosecutors treated the case with the weight of an adult crime, even though she was only 15. Defense team chose to argue that she was not legally responsible because of her mental state. They told the jury she had been so damaged by her past, so abandoned by the people who should have cared for her, and so consumed by her feelings, she had snapped in a moment of true mental breakdown. They asked the jury to see her actions as the result of a mind that was not well, rather than a cold choice to do harm. In December 2009, more than a year after Amanda lost her life, the jury reached its decision, rejected the insanity argument. They did not accept that Tia was unaware of what she was doing, or unable to understand that it was wrong, but they also did not convict her of the most serious charge. Instead, they found her guilty of second-degree murder. In simple terms, the jury seemed to believe that she truly meant to cause great harm, but that it was not the kind of cold, planned-out act that the top charge would require. It was a verdict that sat somewhere in the middle of a case that had no clean answers. The sentencing came in March 2010, and it was one of the most emotional days of the entire ordeal. By then, Tia was 16. The judge, John Murphy, had a wide range of choices in front of him. The defense had asked for a much shorter term in a juvenile facility, around 6 years. On the other end, the law allowed for a sentence as severe as life behind bars. The judge landed firmly on a long term. He sentenced Tia to 25 years. Under his order, she would begin her sentence in a high-security facility, built for young people who had been through abuse and trauma, a place meant to be both strict and rehabilitative. When she reached the age of 21, she would be moved to an adult prison to finish out the rest of her time. Before the sentence was handed down, Tia was given the chance to speak, and what she said left many people in the courtroom in tears. She turned to Amanda's family and apologized directly to them. She told them she would never forgive herself for what she had done, and that she did not expect them to forgive her either. She said she was sickened by herself. There was no attempt to make excuses in that moment, no anger, only a young person breaking down under the weight of a choice she could never undo. Amanda's father later said that hearing real remorse brought him some small measure of peace, and that he felt the sentence was fair. Tia's own grandfather, who had raised her, said he only hoped she could finally get the help that everyone could see she needed. When you step back from all the legal details, the T. Wimberley case stands out for a reason that has nothing to do with courtrooms. Is one of the clearest examples of how this kind of violence, when a girl is involved, so often looks completely different from the image most people carry in their heads. There was no long-planned attack on a crowd. There was no manifesto, no hatred for the world, no goal of becoming famous. There was a wounded teenager, a friendship that fell apart flood of feelings she could not control, and one small firearm carried into a school for one specific person. It is also a case built almost entirely on the word pain. Tia was in pain, kind that had been growing inside her for years, with no one to help her carry it. The thing she did in response was to put that same pain into someone else, someone she had once cared about more than almost anyone. Amanda Collette paid the ultimate price for another person's suffering. And that is perhaps the cruelest part of the whole story. She was not targeted because she had done something wrong. She was targeted because she had once been loved, and because the girl who loved her had no healthy way to deal with losing her. This case also shows how thin the line can be between a tragedy that happens and a tragedy that is stopped. A classmate spoke up. A warning was given, even if it was unclear. A school had tools sitting unused. A girl in crisis had hurt herself the night before and had told people something was wrong. All the pieces of a prevented disaster were there, scattered around, and none of them came together fast enough. That is a pattern you will see again and again as this story goes on, and it never gets easier to watch. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. T fired at someone she had once called a friend, someone she had wanted to be close to, someone whose absence she could not bear. The next girl's door in this story took that idea one terrible step further. Her victim was not a former friend she was trying to win back. Her victim was someone who had actually loved her in return, in a real relationship, and when that relationship began to fall apart, the ending she chose did not leave only one girl gone. It left two. Section 3. Breakup that ended 2 lives. On the morning of February 12, 2016, a quiet covered patio near the cafeteria at Independence High School in Glendale, Arizona, became the scene of something the whole community would struggle to understand for a long time afterward. It was a Friday, just before the start of the school day, around 8 in the morning. Students were arriving, dropping their bags, heading to their first classes in the cool desert morning. Then, 2 15-year-old girls were found lying near each other on the southeast side of campus, each with a single wound, with a firearm resting beside them. Both of them were gone before help could change anything. Their names were Dorothy Dutiel and May Q. They were both sophomores, both 15, and they were not enemies. They were not strangers who had crossed paths by accident. They were a couple. The two of them had been together for more than 2 years, and they had grown up alongside each other long before that. To the people who knew them, they were not a secret. Photos of the two girls showed up across their social media, sometimes laughing together, sometimes kissing each other on the cheek, the ordinary images of 2 teenagers who cared about each other. Their relationship was known and accepted at school. That is part of what made the ending so hard for everyone to take in. This was not violence between people who hated each other, but grew out of a relationship that had been built on love. To understand the weight of what was lost, it helps to know who May Q was. She was, by every account, a remarkable young person. She was an honor student, the kind of teenager who took school seriously and did well. She played on the badminton team. She served as vice president of her school's Key Club, a group focused on volunteering and helping others. She even had a part in the school's production of the musical You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, playing the character Marcy. Her own sister, Fuang, worked at Independence High as a science teacher, which means that on that terrible Friday, teacher at the school lost not just a student, but her little sister. Fuang later described May as smart and good, a girl who tried her best at everything she did. She was exactly the kind of student a school is supposed to send out into the world to do great things. Dorothy Dutiel, who went by the nickname Dot, was harder to read from the outside. And that is one of the most painful parts of her story. To her family, she was the light of her mother's life. Just a few days before that Friday, at a family gathering on the weekend, relatives remembered her being her usual funny, goofy self, the kind of kid who made people laugh. There was no obvious sign to them that anything was about to go horribly wrong. But underneath the jokes, Dot was carrying a heavy and hidden weight. She had been quietly struggling with depression. She felt alone in a way that the people around her could not fully see. On the internet, away from her family's eyes, she had been posting dark messages, some of which would only make sense to people after it was far too late. The thing that seemed to push everything over the edge was the slow ending of her relationship with May. About a week before that Friday morning, Dot learned that May was thinking about breaking up with her. For a teenager already battling hopelessness and a deep fear of being abandoned, news landed like the end of the world. In the writing she left behind, Dot described being told that May did not love her the same way anymore, and she described how that left her feeling like she was not okay at all. She has built so much of her sense of being wanted around this one relationship. The idea of losing it seemed to take away the last thing holding her together. The next piece of the story is one of the most important and also one of the most frustrating, because it shows how a tragedy like this depends on access to something a teenager should never have been able to get so easily. Dot did not own a firearm. She did not have one waiting at home. So the day before the attack, on Thursday, she went to a 15-year-old boy she knew from school and asked him for one. She told him she needed it for protection. She promised to give it back to him the very next day. The boy did something he would surely regret for the rest of his life. He went into his own home, took a family-owned handgun, a Beretta without his parents knowing anything about it, and handed it to her. Think about how fast that happened. In a single day, a heartbroken 15-year-old went from having no weapon at all to walking onto a school campus with a real handgun, simply by asking a classmate for one. The boy who supplied it had no idea what she planned to do with it. He cooperated fully with detectives afterward, and the police looked at whether he should face a charge for giving a firearm to a minor. In the end, both families, the Dutiels and the Kius, said they did not want him prosecuted. They had already lost so much that punishing another teenager for a thoughtless decision was not something either family wanted to pursue. Still, the case became a stark example of how a moment of poor judgment by one kid can hand another kid the means to cause something irreversible. On Friday morning, the two girls met near that covered patio by the cafeteria. Investigators pieced together what happened from the scene and from what Dot herself had written. The conclusion they reached was that Dot took May's life and then immediately ended her own. The firearm was found right beside the two of them. Each girl had a single wound. It was, in the cold language of police reports, a murder followed by a self-inflicted ending, all in the span of a few minutes, in a place where the worst thing that was supposed to happen that day was a hard test or a forgotten homework assignment. The school reacted the way schools now tragically know how to react. Independence High went into immediate lockdown. Students were held in place, then released early, and throughout the day you could see teenagers walking out to find their parents, some of them confused, many of them shaken. Crisis counsellors were brought in. The next night, on Saturday, students and staff gathered for a candlelight vigil to grieve together. May's sister, a teacher, started an online fundraiser to help cover funeral costs. A school that had been ordinary on Thursday was, by the weekend, a place of mourning. What sets this case apart from so many others is the trail of writing Dot left behind. She did not act in silence. investigators found 8 handwritten notes. One of them was tucked into the front pocket of her clothing, and on the morning of the tragedy, a firefighter at the scene was the first to notice the corner of paper sticking out. That particular note was addressed to first responders, the very people who would arrive to deal with what she had done. In a strange, eerily calm way, it explained the situation to them, identified the weapon as the Beretta, and said it had come from a classmate. It identified the victim as her girlfriend, person she had grown up with, and it identified herself as the one who had done it. The other notes were addressed to the people she loved. There were notes to her parents, to her siblings, to her closest friends. Across all of them, a few things came through clearly. Dot took full responsibility for her actions. She insisted that she had acted alone, and she went out of her way to make sure no one else would be blamed, including the classmate who had given her the firearm, and even May herself. She wrote that she believed she was thinking clearly as she wrote, and she said she did not actually approve of what she was about to do, even as she did it. She apologized to her parents for the pain she was causing. She apologized to her mother for small, almost unbearably human things, like the fact that her mother had just bought her new clothes that she would never get to wear. A separate note was later found in her bedroom at home, left for her mother, telling her that she loved her, and that her mother had nothing to do with any of this. Reading about those notes, it is impossible not to feel the size of the tragedy from every direction at once. They are the words of a child in absolute crisis, someone who felt completely hopeless and believed, in a broken and mistaken way, that this was her only path. That is the cruelest lie that deep depression can tell a young person, that there is no other way out and no future worth waiting for. Dot was not a hardened or evil figure. She was a 15-year-old who needed real help with her mind and her heart, who was clearly suffering badly, and who made a permanent decision about a temporary pain. And in the grip of that pain, she did not just end her own story. She took the life of another girl, a kind and gifted girl, who had her whole future in front of her, and who did not get any say in the matter at all. It's the part that must never get lost in the sadness for Dot. May Q was a victim. She did not choose to die. She was a bright, accomplished, well-loved 15-year-old, whose life was taken from her on a school morning by someone she had trusted and cared about. 2 families were shattered that day instead of one. The Kias lost a daughter and a sister who had done everything right. The Duchiels lost a daughter too, while also having to live with the unbearable knowledge of what she had done. Were no winners and no comfort anywhere in it. The Dorothy Dutiel case also fits a pattern you may have started to notice across this story, and it is worth naming plainly. When a teenage girl is involved in this kind of violence, so often grows out of a close relationship rather than out of a desire to hurt the world at large. Brenda Spencer fired at children she had never met. But the cases that came after, again and again, point inward, towards someone the girl knew, someone she had loved, someone whose loss she could not survive emotionally. Dot did not aim at a crowd. She aimed at the one person who had been the centre of her world, and then at herself. The weapon was pointed at love, gone wrong, not at strangers. It is a case about heartbreak that had nowhere safe to go, about a mind in crisis that no one fully saw in time, about how easily a real firearm ended up in the hands of 2 children who should never have been near one. It is about a relationship that started with 2 kids growing up together and ended on a school patio in a matter of minutes. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But up to this point, every girl in this story has had a single focus: a schoolyard full of children, a former friend, a girlfriend, The next case breaks that pattern completely. The girl you are about to meet did not aim at one person she loved or one person she hated. She walked into a room full of people who had done nothing to her at all. And in doing so, she became the first girl in nearly half a century to do the very thing that opened this entire story. Section 4. First in 45 years. On the morning of December 16th, 2024, the students at Abundant Life Christian School in Madison, Wisconsin, doing the most normal thing in the world. It was a Monday, just before 11 in the morning. Only days before the Christmas break, Abundant Life was a small private Christian school that taught kids of every age, from the littlest ones in the early grades all the way up through high school. In one classroom, a study hall was underway, filled with a mix of students from different grades, sitting together, doing quiet work. It was the kind of calm, ordinary moment that fills most of a school day. At 10:57 a.m, a second grade teacher picked up the phone and called 911 to report that there was an attacker inside the building. The person with the firearm was a 15-year-old student at the school named Natalie Rupnow, who went by the name Samantha. She had come to school that day carrying 2 handguns. Inside that mixed-grade study hall, she opened fire on the people around her. When it was over, 2 people had lost their lives, and 6 others were wounded, 2 of them so badly that their lives hung in the balance. Then Natalie ended her own life. She was pronounced gone while being rushed to the hospital. The officers who responded never had to fire a single round, because by the time they reached her, the worst was already finished. The 2 people she took from the world that day had done nothing to deserve it. One was a teacher named Erin West, who was 42 years old. She was remembered by those who knew her as kind and caring, a woman of faith who was part of her local church, the sort of teacher who showed up to help kids learn. The other was a student named Ruby Vergara. Ruby was only 14 years old, a freshman, just a kid at the very start of high school. Death shattered her family and the entire school community. Her funeral was held at a church right next to the school, and the people who loved her were left to grieve a 14-year-old who should have had her whole life ahead of her. 6 more people were hurt. 1 student was still in the hospital, recovering many months later. These were the human beings on the other end of Natalie Rupnow's actions. None of them were chosen because of anything they had done. They were simply in the room. That is the first thing that sets this case apart from the ones that came before it in this story. Girl, in the very first case, fired at children she did not know. But that was decades ago. 2 girls in the cases after that, aimed at one specific person, a former friend and a girlfriend. Natalie Rupnow did something different. She walked into a room full of people, most of whom had no personal connection to her at all, and she attacked indiscriminately. This was not about one broken relationship, it was about something much colder and much harder to understand. And the more investigators learned, darker the picture became. When police searched Natalie's home and her belongings, they did not find the signs of a sudden emotional breakdown. They found evidence of careful, detailed planning. According to court records, there was a specific date marked out. There were maps, there were timelines. There was even a cardboard model of the school, the kind of thing someone builds when they are studying a place and thinking through exactly how to move through it. This was not a spur-of-the-moment act of despair. It was a plan that had been worked on over time, the way someone might prepare for an event they had decided was going to happen. Investigators also discovered that Natalie had a deep and disturbing fixation on violence itself. Police said she had an obsession with mass attacks, school violence, and with weapons. She kept writings and drawings centered on that violence. She had also written a long document, the kind of thing often called a manifesto. in which she expressed admiration for people who had carried out attacks before her, and in which she wrote about humanity in hateful, dehumanizing terms. She wrote about being afraid of other kids, about growing to hate people in general. This was a teenager whose inner world had been taken over by a fascination with causing harm, and who had come to see other people as less than human. Out of respect for the victims, and to avoid giving any attention to the figures she looked to, the specifics of who she admired are not worth repeating here. What matters is the shape of it. She had stopped seeing the people around her as people. A huge part of how she got to that point happened online. That is one of the most modern and frightening elements of this case. Unlike the cases from earlier decades, Natalie did not develop her fixation alone in a bedroom with no outside influence. She had been active in dark corners of the internet, spaces where violence is discussed, celebrated, and encouraged. Investigators traced a web of disturbing online connections leading to and from her. In the months before the attack, she had reportedly been openly talking about violence online. The internet did not create the trouble inside her on its own, but it fed it, sharpened it, and surrounded her with others who pushed her further in the same direction, and, instead of pulling her back, one of those online connections turned into a national story of its own. A young man in California, Alexander Paffendorf, who was 20 at the time, had been exchanging messages with Natalie. According to authorities, he told FBI agents that he had been talking with her about a plan to attack a government building using a firearm and explosives. The day after the school attack, California judge issued an emergency order under that state's red flag law, requiring him to hand over his firearms and ammunition to police. He was not criminally charged, and no firearms were found registered to him. But the fact that her web of contacts included someone discussing his own potential attack shows that Natalie was not an isolated case. She was one node in a larger, troubling network of people egging each other on toward violence. Then there is the question that haunts almost every one of these cases. How did a 15-year-old get her hands on 2 handguns? The answer, in this case, pointed straight at her own home. In her own writings, Natalie said that she had manipulated her father into buying her firearms. Investigators concluded that her father, Jeffrey Roopnow, had given her access to the very weapons she used. In May 2025, several months after the attack, he was arrested and charged with felonies, including intentionally giving a dangerous weapon to a minor and contributing to the delinquency of a child. Court later ordered that he must stand trial. The charges he faced carried the possibility of years in prison. Case became part of a growing pattern across the country, in which the adults who fail to keep firearms away from troubled kids are themselves being held responsible when those kids cause harm. The damage this case did to one single family is almost too much to take in. Daughter took 2 innocent lives and then her own. The father was arrested and charged in connection with the weapons she used. And then, in the summer that followed, Natalie's mother, Melissa Roopnow, passed away in what authorities described as an apparent self-inflicted death. In the space of less than a year, a family of 4 was effectively destroyed, with the daughter and the mother both gone, and the father facing the justice system. The ripples of one Monday morning spread outward and drowned nearly everyone connected to it. Wider community in Madison did what grieving communities do. Flags across the state were lowered to half-staff by order of the governor. Candlelight vigil was held. Funerals were planned for the teacher and the young student who had been taken. People who had nothing to do with the attack found themselves trying to comfort terrified children and explain the unexplainable. One detail from the aftermath says, "Everything about the world these kids are growing up in, The students at the school were already used to practicing drills for exactly this kind of emergency. Month after month, so often that some of them were tired of rehearsing for a nightmare that was never supposed to actually come true. For the students of Abundant Life, the drill became real. There is one more fact about this case that ties it directly back to where this whole story began, and it is the reason it shook experts so deeply. When Natalie Rupnow took multiple lives at her school, she did something that had not happened in the United States for about 45 years. Researchers who study these tragedies pointed out that the last time a teenage girl had taken more than one life on school grounds was all the way back in 1979, with the very first girl in this story, the one who fired from across the street in San Diego. For nearly half a century, that line had not been crossed by another girl. Boys and men carried out these attacks again and again over those decades, but the girls did not, almost never, and never at this scale. Then, just before Christmas in 2024, the line was crossed once more. That rarity is the heartbeat of this entire video, and the Rupnow case proves it in the starkest possible way. The experts who track every one of these events can count the girls involved on a very short list, across hundreds upon hundreds of these tragedies in the United States. The number of girls who have ever done anything close to this is tiny, fraction of a fraction. Natalie Rupnow joined that list as one of the only girls in modern American history to carry out a deadly attack of this kind at a school, and the only one in 2 generations to take more than one life doing it. What makes her case feel so different from the older ones is that it was a product of its time. The girl in 1979 acted out of a chaotic, drug-fueled haze and a desire for attention, with a rifle handed to her by her father. The girls in the cases after that acted out of heartbreak, out of love and loss twisted into something deadly. Natalie Rupnow acted out of a cold, planned, hateful fixation that had been built and fed over months in the dark spaces of the internet, with weapons she had access to at home, heartbreak replaced by ideology, impulse replaced by planning, and a lonely bedroom replaced by an online community of people pushing each toward harm. In that sense, her case is a warning about exactly how this kind of rare violence can take new and more dangerous shapes in the modern world. And yet, for all the modern detail, the core truth is the same as it was in 1979, and in every case in between. A young person in serious trouble, surrounded by warning signs, with access to a firearm she should never have had, walked into a place of learning and destroyed lives that can never be replaced. Erin West and Ruby Vergara are not statistics. They were a teacher and a child who went to school one ordinary Monday and never came home. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Every girl in this story so far carried out what she did on American soil. The next one did it thousands of miles away. In a country where this kind of violence was supposed to be almost impossible, firearms are tightly controlled, and school attacks are rare enough to shock an entire nation. The story is proof that whatever drives these few girls is not stopped by any border on a map. Section 5. The Girl with the Paper Tube. On the morning of December 7th, 2023, a 14-year-old girl walked toward Gymnasium number 5 in the Russian city of Bryansk, carrying what looked like a harmless cardboard tube, the kind students use to carry rolled-up drawings or papers without bending them. Nothing about it would have made anyone look twice. But hidden inside that tube was a pump-action firearm that belonged to her father. Tucked into her right boot, she also carried a hunting knife. She was an 8th grade student at the school, walking the same route she walked every day. And in a matter of minutes, she would turn an ordinary Thursday into one of the rarest and most shocking tragedies in modern Russian history. Bryansk is a city in western Russia, sitting just over 100 kilometers from the border with Ukraine. By late 2023, it was a place living under the shadow of war. The region had been hit by occasional shelling and drone strikes connected to the fighting next door, so the people there already knew what it felt like to live with danger in the air. But what happened at Gymnasium number 5 that morning had nothing to do with the war across the border. It came from inside the school itself, from one of its own students. The first alarm reached the city's emergency dispatch service at around 9:15 in the morning. The girl had made her way up to a classroom on the 4th floor of the building, a biology room, and there she took the firearm out of the tube and began to fire on the people around her. The students in that room were her classmates, kids she saw every single day. When the gunfire was over, 2 people had lost their lives. One was a girl, a fellow student and classmate. The other was the 14-year-old herself, who ended her own life after the attack. 5 more children were wounded. One of them was in serious condition, fighting for survival, and the other 4 had injuries that doctors described as moderate. In just a few terrible minutes, a quiet school in a Russian suburb had become a place of bloodshed. There is one detail from that morning that is almost too painful to think about. A fellow student later told a Russian news agency that when the shots rang out, 2 girls came running into a nearby classroom for safety. One of them was the twin sister of the attacker. Picture that for a moment. While one 14-year-old girl was causing this devastation, her own twin was running for her life in the same building not yet. Noting that the person behind the horror was her sister. The 2 of them had likely grown up side by side, shared a home, shared a face. And on that morning, their lives split apart in the most unimaginable way. How the girl managed to walk into the school carrying a firearm and a knife is a question that made the whole country uneasy. According to a source cited by Russian state media, metal detectors at the school's entrance were not working that day. That single failure may have made all the difference. Working detector might have caught the weapon hidden in the cardboard tube. Instead, she passed through unnoticed, firearm and the blade going undetected, until it was far too late to stop what was coming. It is a chilling reminder that the safety measures schools put in place only matter if they actually function when the moment arrives. The regional governor, Alexander Bogomaz, called the event a terrible tragedy, promised that authorities would find out exactly how a teenager had been able to bring a firearm into a school and use it against her classmates, and he pledged that the families of the girl who lost her life and the injured children would receive all the help they needed. Russia's investigative committee, the agency that handles the country's most serious crimes, opened a formal investigation right away. The girl's father was brought in for questioning, because the firearm she used had belonged to him, and the obvious question was how his daughter had gotten her hands on it. Here is where this case becomes both important and frustrating to tell, unlike the American cases in this story, where we know the names, the backgrounds, the courtroom testimony, sometimes the exact words the girls left behind. The Bryansk case is wrapped in silence. Russian authorities chose not to release the attacker's name because she was a minor. The classmate who lost her life was also not publicly named in the same detail you would see in an American case. And most importantly of all, the motive was never clearly established for the public. Investigators said they were working to figure out why she did it and what had led her to that point, but a clear, confirmed reason was never laid out the way it often is elsewhere. Because of that, it would be wrong to invent a tidy explanation. The honest truth is that the world was left with a horrifying event and very few answers about what was going on inside that 14-year-old's mind. That silence is part of what makes the case so haunting. We are left only with the cold facts. Girl hid her father's firearm in a paper tube. She brought a knife in her boot. She walked into a biology class and turned on the very people she sat beside every day. And then she was gone, taking the answers with her. No manifesto released to the public. No trial to pick apart her thinking. No years of parole hearings where survivors could confront her. There was only the empty space where an explanation should be. To understand just how stunning this event was to Russians, you have to understand the country's relationship with this kind of violence, which is very different from the United States. For most of modern Russian history, mass attacks at schools and universities were extremely rare. Post. They were the kind of thing many Russians associated with America. Something that happened far away and on the news, not something that touched their own children's classrooms. Russia also has strict laws controlling who can own firearms, which for a long time helped keep these events almost unheard of. That sense of safety began to crack in 2021. That year, country was rocked by two separate attacks. In the city of Kazan, a 19-year-old went into a school and took the lives of 9 people. Months later, in the city of Perm, a teenager attacked a university and ended the lives of 6. Then, in September 2022, even worse tragedy struck the city of Izhevsk, where an attacker killed 18 people at a school. These events forced Russia to confront a kind of violence it had mostly believed belonged to other places. Lawmakers responded by tightening the rules around access to weapons even further. But notice something about every one of those earlier Russian attacks. The people who carried them out were all male. The 19-year-old in Kazan, the teenager in Perm, the attacker in Izhevsk, all of them were young men. So when a 14-year-old girl walked into gymnasium number 5, with her father's firearm in a cardboard tube, she was not just breaking Russia's fragile sense of safety. She was breaking the pattern of who does this in the first place. In Russia, just as in the United States, just as nearly everywhere on Earth, this kind of attacker is almost always male. Girl doing it was a rarity, layered on top of a rarity. The Russian president, Vladimir Putin, had spoken publicly about the rise of these school attacks even before Bryansk. He described them as a phenomenon that had been imported from the United States, calling it a kind of dark side effect of a connected, globalized world, where troubled young people in one country can be influenced by the violence of another. Whether or not you agree with how he framed it, there is a real and uncomfortable idea buried inside it. In the age of the internet, the worst impulses of young people are no longer contained by national borders. The same disturbing online spaces, the same fascination with past attackers, the same dark ideas can reach a teenager in a Russian suburb just as easily as they can reach one in an American town. The barriers of distance and language that once kept these things apart have mostly fallen away. That idea connects the Bryansk case back to everything you have already seen in this story. The girl in the previous case, the one in Wisconsin, had been pulled deep into a web of online influences that fed her fixation on violence. We cannot say for certain that the same forces were at work in Bryansk, because the investigation's findings about her mind were never made public, but the broader pattern is impossible to ignore. Across the world, in country after country, tiny number of girls have begun to do something that for generations was almost exclusively done by boys and men, is happening in an era where the ideas that drive this violence travel instantly across the globe. What also stands out about Bryansk is how the weapon got into the girl's hands, because it echoes a theme running through this entire story. In nearly every case we have looked at, the firearm did not come from some shadowy criminal source. It came from the child's own world. In the very first case, a father gave his daughter a rifle as a gift. In the Arizona case, a teenager borrowed a handgun from a classmate who took it from his family's home. In the Wisconsin case, a father gave his daughter access to the weapons she used and was later charged for it. And in Bryansk, the firearm belonged to the girl's own father, kept in their home, accessible enough that she could hide it in a tube and carry it to school. Over and over, the deadliest tool in these tragedies was sitting within reach, inside the family home, owned by a trusted adult who never imagined it would be used this way. The Bryansk shooting eventually faded from international headlines the way tragedies in faraway places often do. The world's attention moved on. But for the families in that Russian suburb, nothing moved on at all. Classmates' family had to bury a daughter who had done nothing but show up to school. 5 other families had to nurse wounded children back to health and help them cope with the terror of what they had witnessed. And the family of the attacker had to live with a double loss and an impossible weight, including a surviving twin sister who would carry the memory of that morning for the rest of her life. The fact that the case generated so few public answers does not make the human cost any smaller. If anything, the silence makes it lonelier. When you step back and look at the Bryansk case alongside the American ones, the most important lesson is also the simplest. This is not only an American problem. For years, people around the world have treated school violence as something uniquely tied to the United States, product of one country's particular struggles. The Bryansk tragedy, carried out by a 14-year-old girl in a nation with strict weapons laws and a long history of safe schools, shows that the darkness behind these attacks can take root anywhere. Specific details change from country to country, but the core ingredients stay the same. A young person in deep trouble, access to a weapon that should have been out of reach, and a quiet failure to see the danger until it was standing in the classroom. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Bryansk still had a firearm at the center of it, just like every case before it. The next girl in this story lived in a country with some of the strictest weapons laws on the entire planet, a place where getting a gun is almost impossible for an ordinary person, let alone a teenager. She did not need one. What she did to her own classmate, in a quiet apartment far away from any schoolyard, would prove something deeply unsettling. When the will to do harm grows strong enough inside a young person, taking away the gun does not take away the danger. It only changes its shape. Section 6. The friend who was chosen Japan is one of the safest countries in the world when it comes to weapons. Its laws around firearms are some of the strictest anywhere on Earth, and getting one is almost impossible for an ordinary person. In a typical year, the entire nation of more than 120 million people sees only a tiny handful of firearm-related deaths, sometimes fewer than you could count on 2 hands. A teenager walking into Japanese school with a firearm. The way we have seen in the cases before this one is something that essentially does not happen. And yet, on a summer evening in 2014, a 15-year-old Japanese girl proved that a person who truly wants to do harm does not need a firearm at all. All she needed was a victim who trusted her enough to come over. The victim was a 15-year-old high school student named Iwa Matsuo. She lived in Sasebo, a port city in the Nagasaki region of southern Japan. Iwa was a first-year high school student, normal teenage girl with parents who loved her and expected her home for dinner like any other night. On Saturday, July 26, 2014, she went to visit a friend at that friend's apartment. The two of them were close. They had known each other through middle school and into high school. The kind of friendship that feels like a fixed part of life when you are a teenager. Iowa had told her parents she was going to her friend's place, and at around 7 in the evening, she sent them a message saying she was about to head home. She never made it home. When the evening stretched on and Iowa did not return, her parents grew worried. By about 11 at night, they contacted the police. Officers began trying to find her, and in the early hours of Sunday morning, they were led to the apartment of the friend Iowa had gone to visit. There, inside that apartment, they found Iowa. She had been attacked with great violence, and her life had been taken. What had been done to her afterward was so disturbing that it horrified the entire country. And out of respect for Iowa and her family, the specific details are not worth describing here. It is enough to understand that investigators, hardened professionals who have seen terrible things, were deeply shaken by what they discovered in that room. The person responsible was the friend whose apartment it was, a 15-year-old classmate of Iowa's. Under Japanese law, minor accused of a crime is normally not named publicly, so for our purposes, her name does not matter. What matters is who she was. The answer is one of the most unsettling parts of the whole case. When police arrived, she did not deny anything. She admitted right away what she had done. There was no struggle, no attempt to escape, no story. She simply confessed. You might expect that a crime this brutal would come from someone living a chaotic, visibly troubled life. The reality was the opposite. That is exactly what made Japan so frightened by this case. The girl came from a wealthy and respected family. Her father was a well-known figure in the local community. She got good grades. She was a talented athlete. A childhood friend described her as someone who had a real sense of responsibility and who was caring toward others. On paper, she looked like a model student, the kind of daughter many parents would be proud of. The monster the public wanted to imagine was nowhere to be seen on the surface. But beneath that polished surface, there had been warning signs for years, stretching back into her childhood. When she was in her 6th year of primary school, just a young child, she did something that should have set off every alarm bell available. According to city officials, she secretly laced the lunches of 2 of her classmates with diluted bleach and cleaning detergent. And she did it not once, but on 5 separate occasions. This was not a single moment of childish foolishness. It was a repeated, deliberate effort to poison other children, carried out by a girl young enough to still be in elementary school. Her father even came to the school at one point to apologize for the lunch poisoning. The behavior was known, it was on the record, and still life moved on. The picture grew darker as she got older, and her home life fell apart in painful ways. Her mother, to whom she had been very close, passed away from illness in the autumn of 2013, when the girl was around 14. Losing a parent at that age is devastating for any child. Not long after, her father remarried. The girl was reportedly furious about the new marriage, and the anger inside her seemed to settle on her father. In March of 2014, just a few months before the killing, that anger turned into violence. While her father was sleeping, she attacked him with a metal baseball bat, striking him hard enough to badly injure him, breaking bones in his face and body. He very nearly did not survive. What happened next was a decision that, looking back, may have set the stage for the tragedy to come. After being attacked by his own daughter, father did not keep her close so he could watch over her. Instead, he and his new wife arranged for the 15-year-old to move out and live entirely on her own in a separate apartment while she attended high school. The idea, based on advice they received, that keeping father and daughter apart would keep everyone safer. A doctor had reportedly warned that if the two of them continued living together, the father could end up dead. So they separated. But in doing so, they placed a deeply troubled 15-year-old girl, a history of poisoning classmates, and a recent violent attack on her own parent, alone in an apartment with no adult supervision at all. That apartment became the place where she would have all the privacy she needed to do something far worse. The most haunting warning of all came just weeks before Iowa died. In June of 2014, a psychiatrist who was aware of the girl actually warned officials that she might commit a killing. Read that again. Trained mental health professional told the authorities, roughly a month before it happened, that this girl could take a human life. The warning existed. It was given to people whose job was to protect children, and yet the system did not move fast enough, forcefully enough to stop what was coming. After the killing, teachers, officials, and others who had known the girl were left searching their own consciences, asking whether they should have done more, whether they had seen the danger and failed to act on it. It is one of the clearest examples in this entire story of a tragedy that was, in a real sense, predicted and still not prevented. Then there is the question of why she did it, and the answer is perhaps the most chilling part of all. In many of the cases we have looked at, the violence grew out of a specific relationship, a heartbreak, a broken friendship, a romance gone wrong. Investigators in this case found something different and far colder. The girl reportedly told police that she had wanted to take a human life for a long time. It was not really about Iowa as a person. She did not hold some burning grudge against her friend. Iowa was not chosen because of anything she had done. She was chosen, it seems, simply because she was a trusting friend who had come to the apartment without suspecting anything. The girl had a deep, disturbing fascination with death and with the human body, and Iowa had the terrible misfortune of being close enough to her to be invited over. This was also not a sudden, unplanned act. Prosecutors later pointed to evidence that the girl had prepared carefully. She had gone to a library and researched the laws around crimes committed by minors, almost as if she were studying what the consequences might be for someone her age. She had also purchased the tools she would use ahead of time, buying them herself. This was a person who thought it through, who planned, who understood on some level what she intended to do, and did it anyway. That planning was a key reason the legal system treated her as fully responsible for the act, rather than as someone who had simply lost control in a single moment. The fallout from the killing did not stop with Iowa's death and the girl's arrest. It reached into the perpetrator's own family with devastating force. After his daughter was arrested, her father released a public statement saying that what she had done could never be forgiven for any reason or under any cause. He did not make excuses for her, but the weight of it all proved to be more than he could bear. It had come out in the media that his daughter had attacked him with a bat months earlier, and that warnings about her had gone unheeded. The public scrutiny was intense and merciless. On October 5, 2014, less than 3 months after Iowa lost her life, the girl's father was found dead at home in what authorities described as an apparent self-inflicted death. So, a single act of violence by one teenager ultimately claimed 2 lives from 2 different families. Iowa, the innocent friend, and the father, crushed under the shame and grief of what his child had done. As for the girl herself, path through the justice system looked very different from what it would have been in the United States. Because she was a minor, because her mental state was so clearly disturbed, Japan did not send her to an ordinary adult prison. In the summer of 2015, family court ruled that she should be sent to a medical reformatory, a special facility designed to treat and reform young offenders with serious psychiatric needs, rather than simply to punish them. She was to be held there for treatment for an indefinite period. To many people, including some who followed the case closely, this felt deeply unsatisfying. They worried that a person capable of such a cold and brutal act might one day be released back into society, her identity still protected, future still open, while Iwa would never grow up at all. There is one more layer to this story that makes it even eerier, and it has to do with the city itself. Sasebo, the place where Iwa lost her life, had been the scene of another shocking killing involving young girls just 10 years earlier. In 2004, in that very same city, an 11-year-old girl took the life of her classmate at their school using a blade. The earlier case had stunned the entire nation and led to a great deal of soul-searching about Japanese children and the pressures they faced. So when another schoolgirl killing struck Sasebo in 2014, it felt to many like a wound reopening, as if the same darkness had returned to the same place after a decade. The girl who carried out the 2004 killing was only 11, too young to belong in a story specifically about teenagers, which is why she is not one of our main cases. But the shadow of that older tragedy hung over the 2014 case and made it feel even more like something had gone deeply wrong, not just with one family, but with something larger. When you place the Sasebo case next to the others in this video, it teaches a lesson that is uncomfortable but important. Up to this point, the firearm has been at the center of every story. Rifle handed over as a gift. A handgun borrowed from a classmate. Handguns provided by a parent. A hunting firearm hidden in a paper tube. Would be easy to walk away, believing that if you simply keep firearms away from troubled young people, you solve the problem. The control of weapons matters enormously, and in country after country, easy access to firearms turns a young person's worst impulse into an irreversible tragedy in seconds. But Japan, with its near-total absence of guns, shows the other half of the truth. The Sasebo girl had no firearm and never needed one. The danger was never only in the weapon. Danger was in a mind that had become fixated on causing harm, a mind that the people around her had been warned about and still failed to stop in time. That is what makes this case so quietly terrifying. There was no dramatic standoff, no crowded classroom, online manifesto broadcast to the world. There was a polite, intelligent, athletic girl from a good family, girl who had poisoned classmates as a child and attacked her father as a teenager, alone in an apartment because the adults in her life did not know what else to do with her. There was a warning from a doctor that went unanswered, and there was a trusting friend who walked through the door on a summer evening and never walked back out. The horror of it is not loud. It is the kind that creeps up on you slowly as you realize how many people saw the danger coming and how little was done. Iwa Matsuo deserves to be remembered as more than the victim of a famous crime. She was a 15-year-old girl who valued her friendship enough to spend a summer evening with someone she trusted. Trust was the only thing she did wrong. And it was not wrong at all. She was simply a good friend to the wrong persons, and she paid for it with her life. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The girl in Sasebo acted completely alone, a single mind turned toward death with no one beside her. The next case flips that idea on its head. The girl who died next was not taken by a stranger or by a friend with a secret fascination with killing. She was taken by the two people she trusted most in the entire world. Her two closest friends, who planned her death together. and when they were finally asked why they did it, the reason they gave was so small, so empty, that it left an entire community unable to understand how it could possibly be true. Section 7. We just didn't. Like her. In the college town of Morgantown, West Virginia, there were 3 girls who seemed inseparable. They drove around together late at night. They slept over at each other's houses. They showed up in each other's photos, laughing, way close friends do. At the centre of that trio was a 16-year-old named Skylar Neese. She was the only child of her parents, Dave and Mary, an honours student who worked part-time at a fast food restaurant and had a real future in front of her. 2 best friends were named Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf. Eddie especially had been close to Skylar since they were little kids, friends since around the age of 8. To anyone watching from the outside, these were 3 normal teenagers in the middle of an ordinary American summer. In reality, 2 of them were planning to end the third one's life. On the night of July 5th, heading into the early hours of July 6th, 2012, Skylar did something teenagers have always done. She waited until her parents were asleep. And then she quietly slipped out of the family's apartment around midnight to go hang out with her friends. She had done this kind of thing before. Eddie and Schoaf were waiting for her. Skylar climbed willingly into the car with the 2 people she trusted most. There was no force, no fear. As far as Skylar knew, she was just sneaking out for a normal late-night drive with her best friends. Instead of staying in the area, the 3 girls drove out of West Virginia and crossed the state line into a rural part of Greene County, Pennsylvania, to a quiet, wooded spot far from anyone who might see or hear anything. And there, in the dark, Eddie and Schoaf turned on their friend. 2 of them had brought knives, and together they attacked Skylar and ended her life. This was not a fight that spun out of control. Investigators later concluded that the 2 girls had planned it, that they had decided ahead of time how it would happen and acted on that plan as a team. After it was done, they left Skylar's body in the woods and tried to hide it, then drove back home as if nothing had happened. Skylar did not come home. Her parents were thrown into a nightmare that would last for months. A host. They knew something was terribly wrong almost immediately, because Skylar was not the kind of girl to simply vanish. Here is where the case reveals one of its cruelest twists, one that would later change the law, because there was evidence that Skylar had home, voluntarily slipping out on her own in the middle of the night. The authorities did not treat her disappearance with the urgency of a kidnapping. For a time, possibility hung in the air that she was just a runaway who would turn up on her own. No widespread emergency alert went out, kind that can flood a region with a missing child's photo within minutes. Her parents knew in their hearts that their daughter had not run away, but the system was slow to agree, and precious time slipped past. What makes this case truly chilling is what Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf did during months, while Skylar's family searched and suffered. They did not disappear. They did not act guilty. Instead, they kept up the performance of being heartbroken friends. Eddy in particular continued to spend time around Skylar's grieving parents, comforting them, acting as though she too was desperate for her friend to come home. On social media, she posted messages about missing Skylar, joining in the public worry over a girl she herself had helped kill. For weeks and weeks, the 2 killers wore the masks of devoted friends, hugging the family they had shattered, posting online about a tragedy they had personally created. It is one of the coldest acts of deception in any of these cases. 2 teenagers calmly grieving in public for someone they had taken in private, but the truth was hiding in plain sight, scattered across the very technology these teenagers lived on. Skylar's own social media posts in the weeks. Before that night, hinted that something had gone wrong in the friendship. Post she had written in ways that suggested she felt pushed out, left behind, as if Eddie and Schoff were pulling away from her and closing her out of their world. Digital breadcrumbs would later help investigators understand the cracks in the trio's friendship. On the other side, the two killers had left their own trail. When detectives looked closely at cell phone records and at video footage from a nearby convenience store, the story Eddie and Showoff had told did not hold up. There were holes in their account, gaps that proved the two of them had lied about that night. The investigators could tell the girls were hiding something. They just did not yet know what or why. The break in the case did not come from clever detective work alone. It came from the inside, from one of the killers cracking under the weight of what she had done. By early 2013, Rachel Schoff was falling apart. The secret was eating her alive, and she suffered a mental health crisis that led to her being hospitalized. In January of 2013, about 6 months after that night in the woods, Schoff confessed. She told authorities that she and Sheila Eddy had planned and carried out Skylar's killing together. And then she did the thing the family had been praying for and dreading all at once. She led investigators to the spot in Pennsylvania where Skylar's body had been left. After half of a year of false hope and unanswered prayers, the Neese family finally had the terrible truth. Now came the question that has haunted this case ever since. The question that an entire community could not wrap its mind around. Why? Why would two girls and carry out the killing of their own best friend, a girl one of them had known since childhood? The first answer they gave was so empty that it almost did not sound real. Schoff reportedly told investigators that they did it because they simply did not like Skylar anymore. They had grown bored with her. They no longer wanted to be friends with her. That was it. No great betrayal, no violent feud, just a friendship the two of them had decided they were finished with, settled not by drifting apart the way teenagers normally do, but by ending a human life. For a long time, that shallow, almost casual reason was the official public explanation, and it made the crime feel even more monstrous. People end friendships every single day without anyone getting hurt. The idea that someone could be killed simply for becoming unwanted was almost impossible to accept. But the full picture, which came out in pieces over the following years, turned out to be more complicated than that infamous line suggested. Prosecutors had hinted early on that the two girls had distanced themselves from Skylar out of fear, worried that if the friendship fell apart, Skylar might reveal certain secrets they wanted kept hidden. Years later, at a parole hearing, Rachel Schoff finally offered more. She revealed that she and Sheila Eddy had been in a secret romantic relationship at the time, and that they were terrified Skylar would expose it. Schoff said they feared what would happen if that secret got out, including how their families and their community might react. So the real motive seems to have been a tangled mix of a hidden relationship, fear of being exposed, friendship that had curdled into something resentful and dangerous. Skylar, it appears, had become a threat to a secret. People closest to her decided the way to protect that secret was to make her disappear forever. Even with that fuller explanation, no reason has ever felt big enough to match the size of what they did. The two girls faced very different outcomes in court, shaped largely by their willingness to cooperate. Because Rachel Schoff had confessed and helped authorities find Skylar's body, she was allowed to plead guilty to a lesser charge, second-degree murder. In the winter that followed, she was sentenced to 30 years behind bars, the possibility of parole after 10. At her sentencing, she apologized to Dave and Mary Neese, telling the court that the person who did this was not the real her, that she had become frightened and caught up in something she did not want to do. Skylar's father was unmoved. He stated bluntly that Rachel had taken his daughter's life in cold blood, and that she could keep her apologies. The prosecution also pointed out something that cut against Schoff's image of a scared girl, swept along against her will. They said the two friends had actually joked about killing Skylar beforehand, even in their science class at school, which suggested the idea had been alive between them for some time. Sheila Eddy's path was harsher, and her attitude was colder. She pleaded guilty to the most serious charge: first-degree murder, roughly 18 months after Skylar's death. The judge sentenced her to life in prison, with a chance at parole only after serving 15 years. Unlike Schoff, Eddy did not apologize to Skylar's parents. Dave Neese has spoken about this many times, saying that Eddy is simply not sorry, that you do not apologize for something you fully meant to do. Both girls were tried as adults, despite being only 16 at the time of the crime. Both ended up serving their sentences in the West Virginia prison system, where, years later, they remained behind bars, out of this senseless loss. Skylar's parents fought to create something that might protect other children. They focused on the gap that had cost them so much time. The fact that no urgent alert had gone out for their daughter, because she appeared to have left on her own. Their efforts led to a new West Virginia law, often called Skylar's Law, which changed the state's emergency alert system for missing children. Under the new rule, missing child could trigger an alert even in cases where it looked like the child might have left voluntarily. Thinking was simple and born from pain. A teenager sneaking out is not proof of safety. The hours after a child vanishes are too precious as to waste on the assumption that they will simply come back. In Skylar's name, family made sure that future missing kids would not fall through the same crack their daughter fell through. The Skylar Neese case became one of the most talked about crimes of its era, and a big reason for that was the role of technology. This was a killing of the social media age, where the victim's own posts hinted at the coming storm, where the killers tweeted about their missing friend, and where phone records and video footage eventually helped expose the lies, has been the subject of books and television documentaries, with people endlessly trying to understand how a friendship could rot into something deadly. The label that often gets attached to Eddy and Schoff is that they were like real-life mean girls, but that phrase is far too small for what they actually did. Cruelty in a friend group is common. Planning and carrying out the killing of one of your own is something else entirely. What this case shows, more than any other so far, terrible weight of betrayal. The girls in some of the earlier cases attacked strangers, or acted alone, or struck out in a single moment of breakdown. Skylar Neese was not killed by a stranger or by chance. She was killed by the two people she trusted more than almost anyone else in the world, in a place she went to willingly because she believed she was safe with them. The danger did not come from outside her life, it came from the very center of it, from the friendships she counted on. And the people around all three girls, parents and teachers and neighbors, had no idea that anything was wrong, because on the surface, these were just three ordinary teenagers being teenagers. The rot was hidden underneath, invisible until it was far too late. Skylar Neese deserves to be remembered as the bright, hard-working girl she was, not just as a victim in a famous case. She was a daughter who was loved, an only child whose parents have spent years honoring her memory and fighting so that her death might spare another family the same agony. She trusted her friends, and there was nothing wrong with that. Wrong belonged entirely to the two girls who took that trust and turned it into a weapon. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Skylar was taken by two friends acting in secret, away from any witnesses. The next girl in this story was attacked in almost the opposite way, surrounded by a whole crowd of teenagers. Most of them girls turned on her in a single brutal night. What began as a group beating over rumours and petty social cruelty would spiral into something none of them could take back, and at the centre of it stood one teenage girl who made sure the victim would never get up again. Section 8. The Swarm Under the Bridge. In the autumn of 1997, in a quiet middle-class suburb of Victoria, British Columbia, in Canada, there was a 14-year-old girl named Rena Verk who wanted, more than almost anything, to belong. Rena was of South Asian descent, the daughter of Manjit and Suman Verk, a family that stood out in their community in more ways than one. Unlike many South Asian families nearby, the Verks were devout Jehovah's Witnesses, which set Rena apart from her peers at a time in life when fitting in feels like everything. She was a teenager, caught between worlds, struggling to find her place. And like a lot of kids in that situation, she was bullied. She did not look like the other girls. She did not live like them. And she ached to be accepted by them. That deep, ordinary teenage longing to be part of the group is what makes what happened to her so unbearably sad. On the night of November 14, 1997, a Friday, a large group of local teenagers gathered the way they often did on weekend nights, to hang out and socialise. They met on a field behind Shoreline School in the area. When police showed up and broke up the gathering, the group moved on to a nearby spot under the Craigflower Bridge, a place teenagers used to congregate away from adult eyes. Rena was there too, among kids she thought of as her friends, or at least as the crowd she desperately wanted to be part of. She had no idea that the night would end with her life being taken by some of the very people she was trying to be close to. Under the bridge, a host. Something turned. There had been rumours going around, and one girl believed that Rena had been spreading stories about her. In an act that signalled the start of the horror, that girl put out a burning cigarette on Rena's forehead. It was a small, deliberate cruelty, kind of thing meant to humiliate. And it opened the floodgates. What followed was an attack that the word bullying is far too gentle to describe. Rena was swarmed by a group of 8 teenagers, 7 girls and 1 boy, all of them 16 years old or younger. They surrounded her and set upon her together, striking her over and over, while she had no way to defend herself or escape. As the blows rained down, Rena cried out that she was sorry. She apologized again and again to a crowd that would not stop. Around her, the scene was its own kind of nightmare. Some of the teenagers who had been there scattered once the violence began, wanting no part of it, but others stayed and watched. They stood there as a group of kids beat a 14-year-old girl into the mud, treating it almost like entertainment, spectacle to witness, rather than a crime to stop. Nobody pulled the attackers off. Nobody ran for help in time to matter. Crowd became part of the event. And that collective failure, that willingness of so many young people to either join in or simply observe, one of the things that shocked an entire nation when the full story came out. When the initial attack finally ended, Rena was badly hurt, but she was alive. Somehow she managed to get to her feet and stagger away, crossing the bridge in the direction of home, bleeding and beaten but still moving, still trying to survive. For a moment, might have ended there as a brutal assault that she could have recovered from. But it did not end there. 2 of the teenagers, who had taken part in the first attack, decided that it was not finished. A 15-year-old girl named Kelly Ellard and a 16-year-old boy named Warren Glowatsky followed Rena across the bridge to where she had fled. There, away from the larger crowd, the 2 of them attacked her a second time. This time the violence was even worse. and this time Rena did not survive it. Her life was taken near the water of the gorge, the waterway that ran beneath the bridge. Then Rena was simply gone, and her family was left to suffer. When she did not come home, her parents reported her missing, and a search began. Rena was not found quickly. For 8 long days, the Verks lived in agonizing uncertainty, not knowing where their daughter was or what had happened to her. Finally, on November 22, 1997, Rena's body was recovered from the water beneath the Craigflower Bridge. The wait was over, replaced by a grief that would never end. A 14-year-old girl, who had only wanted to be liked, had been taken by a group of her peers and left in the water, and it had taken more than a week to even find her. The investigation moved relatively fast once it began, because this was not a crime committed in secret by one skillful person. It had been witnessed by a crowd of teenagers. Within about a week of the body being found, arrests were made, and over time the full scope of who had been involved became clear. In total, 8 young people were charged in connection with the attack on Rena. Most of them, the ones who had taken part in the initial swarming, faced charges related to the assault, and a group of girls were ultimately convicted for their roles in beating her. But 2 of them, the 2 who had followed Rena and attacked her the second time, faced the most serious charge of all. Kelly Ellard and Warren Glowatsky were charged with her killing. The 2 of them took very different paths through the justice system. Contrast between them became one of the most striking parts of the entire story. Warren Glowatsky went to trial first. In June of 1999, convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, with no chance at parole for 7 years. But what happened to Glowatsky after that conviction is genuinely remarkable. Over the years he spent behind bars, he took part in rehabilitation programs, and he came to face what he had done with real honesty. He expressed deep remorse, and in one of the most extraordinary acts of grace in any case like this, Rena's own parents, Manjit and Suman Verk, agreed to meet with him through a process focused on healing rather than only punishment. Glowatsky sought their forgiveness, and the Verks, carrying a grief most people cannot imagine, met him face to face. His genuine remorse and his rehabilitation eventually led to him being granted full parole in 2010. He became, in a strange way, an example of what accountability and change can look like. Kelly Ellard's journey through the courts could not have been more different. And it dragged on for years. Her path to a final conviction was long and tangled. The kind of legal saga that tested the patience and the hearts of everyone who cared about justice for Rena. She was first found guilty of second-degree murder in 2000, but that conviction was overturned on appeal, sending the case back to be tried again. A later trial ended without a verdict when the jury could not agree, resulting in a mistrial. It was not until 2005, after multiple trials and appeals, that Ellard was once again convicted of second-degree murder. Even then, the legal fight continued, until Canada's highest court, the Supreme Court of Canada, finally upheld her conviction in 2009, more than a decade after Rena lost her life. The question of Ellard's guilt was at last settled for good. Although she had been only 15 at the time of the crime, she was tried and sentenced as an adult, and she received a life sentence. The years since, Ellard's story has continued to be a troubled one. At some point, she changed her name to Kerry Sim, stepping away from the identity that had become infamous across Canada. While serving her life sentence, she was eventually granted day parole, limited form of release into the community, and she became a parent. But unlike Glowatsky, her time under supervision has been rocky. As recently as 2025, the parole board revoked her day parole after she tested positive for methamphetamine and breached the conditions of her release. Officials determining that her behaviour had worsened and that she posed a risk. So, while one of Rena's killers found a path to genuine change and freedom, the other has remained tangled in the consequences of her own choices, decades after that night under the bridge. The killing of Rena Verk did not just devastate one family, it shook an entire country and forced difficult national conversation that Canada had not really had before. People were horrified, not only by the brutality of the attack, but by who had carried it out. These were not hardened adult criminals, they were teenagers, and most of them were girls. The idea that a group of ordinary teenage girls could swarm and beat another girl, they could chase her down and take her life, challenged everything people wanted to believe about who commits this kind of violence. The case became a touchstone for discussions about bullying, about the cruelty that can run through teenage social groups, and about racism, since Rena, a girl of colour, had been an outsider targeted in part for being different. Her parents channeled their unimaginable grief into purpose, becoming voices against bullying, working to make sure other children might be spared what their daughter endured. Rena's father even wrote a book telling her story from a parent's point of view. Over the years, the case has been retold many times, in books, plays, in podcasts, and most recently in a television series, keeping Rena's name in the public memory. With that ongoing attention comes a risk that is worth naming. It is easy, when a crime becomes this famous, to focus so much on the killers and the courtroom drama that the victim becomes a footnote in her own story. Rena Verk should never be reduced to that. She was a real 14-year-old girl, with a family who loved her, hopes and insecurities, like any teenager, whose only mistake was wanting to be accepted by people who did not deserve her trust. When you look at the Rena Verk case alongside the others in this story, it stands out for the sheer number of young people involved and for what that reveals about how violence can spread through a crowd. In most of the earlier cases, the danger came from one girl, from two acting together in secret. Here, an entire group took part. Some threw the punches and kicks, some simply watched and did nothing. Two went further than all the rest. It shows how a mob can take on a life of its own, how the presence of a crowd can make individual teenagers do things they might never do alone, each one feeling a little less responsible, because so many others are involved. The desire to belong, the very thing Rena was reaching for, twisted on the other side into something monstrous, as a group of kids bonded over cruelty and egged each other on past every line that should stopped them. There is also a painful symmetry at the heart of it. Rena wanted to be part of the group so badly that she stayed even when she crowd should have run. The teenagers who attacked her seemed driven, in part, by their own group dynamics, by rumours and social standing, and the desire not to be the one left out. The same human need for belonging that made Rena vulnerable was the need that, in a darker form, fueled the crowd that turned on her. It is a reminder of how powerful and how dangerous that need can be in the teenage years, when fitting in can feel more important than almost anything, including basic decency. The Rena Verk case left Canada asking how a group of its own children could do something so cruel, and it left her family with a hole that no verdict could ever fill. The slow, grinding path to justice, with its overturned conviction, its mistrial, and its years of appeals, only deepened the pain, forcing the Verks to relive the worst night of their lives over and over in courtrooms. And yet, through the remorse of one of the killers and the grace of Rena's own parents, the story also held a small, hard-won lesson about the possibility of accountability and change, even in the face of the unforgivable. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So far, violence in these group cases happened fast. A beating under a bridge that escalated in a single night, 2 friends who acted in a single dark hour. The final case in this story is different, and many people consider it the most disturbing of all. It was not quick. It was not a sudden loss of control. It was a group of teenage girls who took a victim and drew out their cruelty over hours, all of it set in motion by one girl's jealousy. And the person they targeted was the youngest victim in this entire story, a child who had done nothing at all to deserve what they had planned for her. Section 9. The youngest victim. Every story in this video has involved a young life cut short, but the last case is the one many people find hardest to bear, because the victim was the youngest of them all. Her name was Shanda Shara, and she was just 12 years old. She was a sweet, ordinary girl living in southern Indiana in the early 1990s, a child who had recently moved to a new town, and was still finding her footing, the way any kid does after starting over. She liked the things 12-year-olds like. She had a whole life still ahead of her. And on a cold January night in 1992, 4 teenage girls took that life from her in a way so cruel that it has haunted American true crime for more 3 decades. Before going further, it is worth being honest about how this case fits among the others, because it is different. In nearly every story so far, the victim and the people who harmed her shared a school, a classroom, a daily life. Shanda's case is the exception. 4 girls who took her life were not her classmates. They were older teenagers, some of whom lived nearly an hour away, and a couple of them had never even met Shanda before the night they helped end her life. The only thread connecting Shanda to her killers ran through school, but not her own relationship with them. It ran through a girl named Amanda Hevrin, whom Shanda had met and grown close to at school. That closeness is what set everything in motion, and it is the reason this case belongs in the same conversation, even if the connection is looser than the others. The root of it all was jealousy, the ordinary teenage kind that spiraled into something monstrous. A 16-year-old girl named Melinda Lovelace had been in a relationship with Amanda Hevrin. Their relationship had grown strained over time, and then Amanda began growing closer to Shanda. 2 younger girls had met at school, where their friendship had blossomed into something romantic, with notes passed back and forth, and a visible closeness that people noticed. For Melinda, this was unbearable. Her jealousy over losing Amanda's attention turned into a burning obsession, and that obsession settled onto Shanda as the rival who had taken what Melinda wanted. In the months before that January night, Melinda did not keep her feelings quiet. She confronted Shanda. She made threats. She talked openly to people about wanting to hurt her, even about wanting to end her life. The warning signs were loud, but no one imagined she would actually act on them. Melinda did not act alone. She pulled 3 other teenage girls into her plan, and the group dynamic among them is one of the most disturbing parts of the case. Was Laurie Tackett, 17. A deeply troubled girl with a fascination for the occult and for violence, who was reportedly eager to be involved. There was Hope Rippey, 15, and there was Tony Lawrence, also 15, who would turn out to be the most reluctant of the 4. Years later, in court, people would learn about the painful and damaged backgrounds some of these girls came from. One had been diagnosed with a serious mental illness and had experienced disturbing episodes from a young age. Melinda herself testified that she had suffered abuse within her own home. None of this excuses what they did, and it should not, but it helps explain, at least a little, how 4 young people ended up in a place dark enough to plan harm against a child. On the night of January 10, 1992, the plan was set into motion with a lie. Shanda was staying at her father's home for the weekend. two of the girls, Tony Lawrence and Hope Rippey, came to the door and told Shanda they would take her to see Amanda. To a 12-year-old who cared about Amanda, it was an exciting invitation, and Shanda agreed to go. She had no way of knowing that there would be no meeting with Amanda, and that she was not simply going for a ride with two girls. Hidden in the car was Melinda Lovelace, the girl who had been threatening her, armed and waiting. Behind the wheel was Laurie Tackett. The trap was complete. The moment Shanda stepped into that car, trusting that she was being taken to someone she cared about. What happened over the next several hours is among the most horrific in the history of crimes committed by young people, and out of respect for Shanda and her family, the details do not need to be laid out here. It is enough to understand the shape of it. The girls drove Shanda to remote, isolated places, including an abandoned house that local teenagers used as a hangout. There, and at other spots through that long night, they subjected her to prolonged, deliberate cruelty. This was not a single sudden blow struck in anger. It was hours of suffering inflicted on a 12-year-old child, drawn out over a long stretch of the night, until by the morning of January 11, Shanda's life had been taken. The cruelty of it, the length of it, and the youth of both the victim and her attackers combined into something that genuinely shocked even hardened investigators. Perhaps the detail that captures the coldness of that night most chillingly is what the girls did afterward. Having spent hours destroying a child, they did not collapse in horror or rush to confess. Instead, they reportedly stopped to get breakfast at a fast food restaurant, sitting down to eat, as though it had been a perfectly normal night out. That image of teenagers calmly eating a meal in the hours after what they had done says more about the emptiness at the center of the crime than any description of the violence itself could. The horror did not stay hidden for long, and the way it came to light shows that not all four girls had silenced their consciences. On the morning of January 11, two hunters came across Shanda's body in a rural area. Meanwhile, Melinda, almost unbelievably, went to find Amanda that very same day and told her what they had done, even showing her evidence of it. All four girls had been sworn to keep the secret, but the weight of it proved too heavy for the two youngest. That night, Tony Lawrence and Hope Rippey, unable to live with what they had been part of, told their parents and then went to the police. By the next day, all four girls were in custody. The case had cracked open not through brilliant detective work, through the guilt of teenagers who could not carry the truth. The legal outcomes reflected the different roles each girl had played. All four were treated as adults by the justice system, and all four ultimately accepted plea agreements rather than risk the harshest possible punishment at trial. Melinda Lovelace, the one who had set the whole thing in motion out of jealousy, and Laurie Tackett, who had been deeply involved in the violence, received the heaviest sentences, pleaded guilty to the most serious charges, and was sentenced to 60 years behind bars. Hope Rippey, seen as having played a significant but somewhat lesser role, received a long sentence that was later reduced on appeal. Tony Lawrence, who had been the most reluctant, who had reportedly stepped away before the worst of it, and who had cooperated early with the authorities, was allowed to plead to a lesser charge and received 20 years. But sentences, no matter how long they sound, eventually run their course. One by one, all four of Shanda's killers walked free. Tony Lawrence was released first, paroled around the year 2000 after serving roughly 9 years. Hope Rippey was released in 2006 after about 14 years. Laurie Tackett was released in 2018, having served more than 2.5 decades. And Melinda Lovelace, the last of the four to leave prison, released in 2019, after serving more than 26 years. For the people who loved Shanda, the gradual release of the girls who took her was its own slow form of pain. Shanda, who was 12 when she lost her life, would be a grown woman in her 40s today, perhaps with a family of her own. Instead, she remains forever 12, while the 4 who ended her life have each been given the chance to grow up, grow old, and rebuild. Melinda Loveless, after her release, reportedly went on to train service dogs to help people living with trauma and disabilities, a fact that many find difficult to reconcile with what she did. The Shanda Sharer case became one of the most studied and retold crimes of its kind, the subject of books and documentaries, precisely because it is so hard to understand. People want crimes to make sense. They want a motive big enough to match the horror. But here the motive was almost absurdly small compared to the result. A teenage love triangle, jealous 16-year-old who could not stand that her ex had grown close to someone else. From that ordinary spark of teenage envy, 4 girls built a night of cruelty that ended a child's life. The gap between the trigger and the outcome is staggering, forces an uncomfortable question. How does jealousy over a relationship become a plan to destroy a 12-year-old? The honest answer is that it should not be possible. And yet it happened, which is exactly why the case continues to disturb people decades later. What stands out most about this case, when placed beside the others, is the role of the group and how one person's obsession can sweep others into something they might never have done alone. Melinda was the engine of it. Jealousy was the original poison. But she did not act on it by herself. She drew in Tackett, whose own darkness made her willing, then Rippy and Lawrence. Younger girls who seemed to have been pulled along by peer pressure and the desire not to be left out of the group. The same social forces that shape so much of teenage life, the pull to belong, the fear of standing apart, the way a strong personality can bend a weaker one. All of it turned lethal that night. It is the darkest possible version of what happens when young people stop thinking as individuals and start moving as a pack, each one a little less able to say stop because the others have not. And at the centre of all of it was a child who simply did not deserve any of it. Shanda Sharer had done nothing wrong. She had made a friend, grown close to her, and that was the entirety of her crime, in the eyes of the girl who hunted her. She trusted an invitation to go see someone she cared about, the way any 12-year-old would. Her trust, her youth and her innocence were used against her by people who should have protected someone so much younger than themselves. She was the youngest victim in this entire story, and in many ways she represents the purest example of how senseless this kind of violence truly is. There was no feud she had started, no rival she had wronged, no danger she posed to anyone. She was a little girl caught in the crossfire of an older girl's obsession. The murder of Shanda Sharer closed out a decade and opened a long national conversation about what was happening with young people, jealousy and cruelty, and the terrifying things teenagers are sometimes capable of when the wrong mix of personalities comes together. It remains a case people return to again and again, not for entertainment, but because it refuses to be understood, because Shanda deserves to be remembered. Not as a footnote to her killer's infamy, but as a 12-year-old girl who was loved, who had a future, and who had it stolen by 4 people barely older than she was. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Shanda's killers hid what they did in the dark, dragging it out over long hours, far from anyone who might have stopped them. The last girl in this story did the exact opposite. She carried out her attack in the most public place she possibly could. Inside a packed school classroom, with her teacher standing close by, and more than 20 of her classmates watching, in the middle of an ordinary school morning. The thing that set her off was something we have already seen tear through these stories more than once. Jealousy over a person she could not stand to lose. Section 10. In front of everyone, the new school year was only a few days old. On the morning of September 12, 2018, the students at Fitzgerald High School in Warren, Michigan, a suburb just north of Detroit, were settling back into their routines. Still getting used to new class schedules and summer, feeling like it had only just ended. For a 16-year-old sophomore named Denina Gibson, it was the 5th full day of her sophomore year. She was sitting in an economics class that morning, surrounded by about 20 of her classmates and her teacher, in the ordinary safety of a school building during first period instruction. There is almost no place a parent would consider safer for their child than a classroom full of students with a teacher at the front. And yet that classroom is where Denina's life was taken, in front of everyone, by a girl she went to school with. That girl was Tanaya Lewis, 17 years old, also a student at Fitzgerald. What makes this case so jarring is how little either girl fit the picture people carry of violence. Denina was a straight-A student, beloved by her teachers and well-liked by her classmates. Tanaya was also a straight-A student, an honours-level kid with no record of trouble at all. The dean in charge of discipline at the school would later say he barely knew who she was because she had never been sent to him for anything. These were not two kids on the margins, not students anyone had flagged as dangerous. They were two high-achieving teenagers, the kind schools point to with pride. And on that September morning, one of them brought a knife from her own kitchen and took the other one's life in the middle of class. Before going further, Denina deserves to be known as more than the victim in this story. Denina Unique Gibson was born in November 2001 to her parents, Angelina Ford and Preston Gibson. Those who loved her described her as sensitive and responsible, kind of person who could brighten the day of everyone around her. She poured herself into her school. She ran on the cross-country team. Host, she was part of the colour guard and the marching band. She was a member of the National Honour Society, took part in student council, and joined the robotics club. She had a real love of science, and she had already set her sights on studying computer engineering in college. She was, in every sense, a girl building toward a bright future, with the grades and the drive to get there. All of that was stolen in a matter of seconds by someone who sat in the same building with her every day. The morning of the attack unfolded with terrible speed. Around 8:30, in the economics classroom, Tanaya approached Denina and pulled out a steak knife she had carried to school from home. She attacked Denina with it, wounding her twice in the upper body, and one of those wounds struck a vital area that would prove fatal. Denina tried to get away, and what witnesses described next is one of the most chilling details of the entire case. Tanaya chased Denina through the classroom and attacked her. She was reportedly smiling and laughing. This was not a girl in a blind panic or a sudden rage that horrified even herself. Multiple witnesses told police she appeared to be enjoying it, even after the teacher managed to intervene and pull her out of the classroom. Tanaya reportedly kept making threats, repeating that she intended to end Denina's life. The fury did not burn out once the act was done. It kept going. The other students in that room were left with images no teenager should ever carry. One classmate, also 17, later described hearing screaming, and at first thinking everyone was scrambling away from something harmless, like a bug in the room. Then the truth became clear, and she ran, afraid the attacker might turn on everyone. Picture a class of sophomores, kids who had come to school to learn about supply and demand, suddenly watching one of their classmates attack another while laughing. Kind of moment does not leave a person. Every one of those roughly 20 students and the teacher became a witness to something that would haunt them for years. Help was immediate, but it was not enough. A school resource officer stationed at the building responded right away and began giving Danina life-saving care, performing CPR until the fire department arrived to take over. Danina was rushed to a hospital. Despite everything the officer and the medical teams did, she could not be saved. She passed away later that morning during surgery. Girl, who had walked into school that day as a healthy, thriving 16-year-old, was gone before lunchtime, and a building full of children and staff was left in shock. The reason behind it all, once investigators pieced it together, was painfully ordinary, which somehow makes it worse. The conflict between the two girls was over a boy. There was a male classmate, a boy named Evan, whom Tanaya had dated, according to what came out in the investigation and in court. Tanaya described Evan as the love of her life. Two of them had broken up over the summer, but Tanaya believed they were working things out and getting back together. The problem, in her mind, Danina. After the breakup, Evan had begun talking with Danina, and Tanaya became convinced that Danina was trying to take him away from her. She also believed Danina had spread a false claim that Tanaya had been unfaithful, and that this lie was part of why the relationship had fallen apart in the first place. In Tanaya's telling, Danina was the obstacle ruining her chance at the relationship she wanted. When a detective asked her about Danina during questioning, Tanaya said plainly that she did not like her. There was also a detail that revealed just how tangled Tanaya's mind was around this boy. Investigators found that she had been in contact with Evan right around the time of the attack. She texted him just before she went after Danina, and about 20 minutes after the attack, she called him. When he asked her why she had done it, she told him she was sorry. The whole thing, in her head, seemed to revolve around him, as though removing Danina would somehow clear the path back to the relationship she was grieving. It is the logic of obsession, not reason, and it cost an innocent girl her life over a high school breakup. One more uncomfortable fact sat at the centre of how this was even possible. Fitzgerald High School had no metal detectors, nothing at the entrance to stop a student from walking in with a kitchen knife in her bag. Tanaya simply brought it from home, carried it into the building like any other item in her backpack, and no system existed to catch it. It is the same quiet vulnerability seen in case after case in this story, the gap between the safety we imagine schools provide and the reality of how easily a determined person can carry harm through the front door. What followed was a long and painful journey through the courts, one that tested Danina's family for years. Tanaya was charged with first-degree premeditated murder, the most serious charge available. But almost immediately, the case slowed to a crawl. There were questions about her mental state, and a competency evaluation was ordered to determine whether she understood the charge against her, and help in her own defence. By the end of 2018, she was found competent to stand trial. Even so, the delays kept coming. Her defence sought a second psychological opinion after a state-appointed expert found her mentally fit, waiting on those evaluations, pushed the trial date back again and again, from the fall of 2019 into 2020. For Danina's family, each delay reopened the wound. Her aunt spoke publicly about how every time they showed up to court only to learn the case had been postponed again, felt like another blow to the heart, like justice was being denied to them over and over. Imagine grieving a child and being asked, again and again, to brace yourself for a court date that then gets cancelled, stretching the agony out across years. While the legal system did its slow work, the people who loved Danina were stuck in a kind of suspended pain, unable to move forward, because the case that defined the worst day of their lives kept getting pushed down the road. To their credit, in that same period, her family worked to keep her memory and her legacy alive. Refusing to let her become just a name in a headline, the case finally reached its resolution in the summer and fall of 2020. In August, Tanaya, by then 19 years old, entered a plea of no contest to first-degree premeditated murder. A no contest plea is not exactly an admission of guilt, but it is treated the same way for sentencing purposes, and it allowed the case to be settled without a full trial. Crucially, plea was made with an understanding that she would remain eligible for parole later in life, rather than facing the harshest possible outcome post. That brings up an important point about how the law treats young people, one that runs through several of the cases in this story. First-degree murder normally carries a sentence of life in prison with no chance of parole. If Tanaya had been an adult, that is almost certainly what she would have faced. But she had been only 17 at the time of the attack. Courts in the United States have recognized that teenagers are not simply small adults. Their brains are still developing, particularly the parts that handle impulse control and the ability to fully grasp long-term consequences. Because of this, Judge had the discretion to hand down a lesser sentence rather than locking a teenager away forever, with no hope of release. Prosecutor in the case pointed directly to this idea, noting that because of her age, Tanaya lacked the brain development to fully understand the long-term consequences of what she did. This does not excuse the act. It simply reflects a legal understanding that a child who does something monstrous is not beyond every possibility of change, should not always be treated identically to a grown adult who does the same. On September 16th, 2020, just days after the second anniversary of Denina's death, Tanaya Lewis was sentenced. The judge gave her 27 to 60 years in prison. She was given credit for the time she had already spent in jail, awaiting resolution, which amounted to more than 700 days, and she was ordered to have no contact with Denina's family. Under the sentence, she would not even be eligible to be considered for parole until she had served 27 years, meaning she will be well into middle age before she has any chance at freedom and may serve far longer. At the sentencing, Tanaya spoke words, and her words were those of a young woman who seemed to understand far too late the magnitude of what she had done. She said that if she could take it back, she would. She told the court she accepted punishment and knew that no amount of apologies could ever undo it. She said she was deeply sorry and that she hoped one day the family might be able to forgive her. She admitted that she still had nightmares about the attack. Whether her remorse was genuine or not is something only she truly knows, but the contrast with the laughing girl from that classroom 2 years earlier was stark. Denina's father was not interested in the question of what the fight had been about. In response to all the talk of a boy and jealousy and rumours, he made the only point that mattered. He said he did not care what it was over. Whatever it was, it did not call for anyone to take his daughter's life. He spoke about the depth of the family's loss in a way that needed no legal language, saying he would not wish this kind of pain on his worst enemy. In a few plain sentences, he cut through all the courtroom complexity to the simple, devastating truth at the heart of it. A father had lost his child, and no sentence, no apology, and no explanation would ever bring her back. When you look at the Tanaya Lewis case as the final story in this collection, it stands out for being the purest example of what this entire video set out to examine. This was not a killing that happened off in some remote woods or a private apartment. It was not aimed at strangers from a distance. It happened inside a school, in a classroom, during class with a teacher present and roughly 20 students watching. Any case here truly fits the idea of a girl who became a school killer in the most literal sense. It is this one. The crime and the school were not just connected. They were the same place, and yet, for all that it took place in a classroom, force driving it was the oldest and smallest thing imaginable. Not politics, not a fascination with violence, not a desire for fame, teenage jealousy over a relationship. The kind of heartbreak and rivalry that plays out in high schools everywhere. Every single day, almost always without anyone getting hurt. That is what makes this case so unsettling. The motive was something millions of teenagers experience, survive, and grow past. In Tanaya, that ordinary pain twisted into something lethal, and she carried a knife into a classroom. Because she could not accept that a boy had moved on, and that Danina might be part of his life instead of her. It also closes this story by circling back to a theme that has appeared again and again. So many of these cases, especially the ones involving girls, were not about hatred for the wider world. They were about a single relationship, a single obsession, a single person the girl could not bear to lose, or could not stand to see with someone else. Tanaya did not want to harm the world. She wanted to remove one specific person who stood between her and the boy she was fixated on. The violence was personal, aimed, rooted in the intimate dramas of teenage life, even though it exploded in the most public setting possible. Two straight-A students, bright futures, both the kind of kids teachers brag about, and one of them ended the other's life in front of a classroom of witnesses over boy. Danina Gibson should be in her 20s now, perhaps finishing an engineering degree, perhaps starting a career, perhaps doing any of the 1,000 things her talent pointed toward. Instead, she is gone, and a young woman who could have had her own future is set to spend most of her life behind bars. There were no monsters in that classroom, no obvious villains anyone saw coming. There were just two teenagers, and a knife, and a jealousy that should never have been allowed to grow into something deadly. That is the last of the 10. 10 girls scattered across more than 4 decades and 4 different countries, each one having done something that almost no girl in history has ever done. Now that every story has been told, the real work begins. The part where we hold all 10 of them up against each other and ask the questions that matter most. What, if anything, actually links these girls together? Why this kind of violence is so astonishingly rare among girls in the first place? And what these rare, terrible exceptions can teach us about warning signs, about weapons within reach, about the children we sometimes fail to see clearly until it is far too late. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.